So welcome, everyone. Before I turn this over to our speakers, I'm going to ask you all to answer a poll. Just click on whichever one is right. And the 3 questions for anyone who's listening in by phone is, are you or your executive director thinking of leaving in less than 3 years, 3 to 5 years, or you're not sure? So if you could please put your responses in right now. I'll give you just a minute, and then we'll look at the results. Okay, so what we've got is 3 people who are thinking about leaving in less than 3 years, 1 person who's thinking about leaving in 3 to 5 years, and nobody chose not sure. So that's kind of where our audience is, and I'm now going to ask Jan Jackson, who's on the phone, to talk to us a little bit about why we're doing this series of webinars about succession planning. So Jan, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Debbie. On behalf of everyone at the Kids Count team at the Casey Foundation, I'd like to welcome you and thank you so much for taking the time to be on the call, and also want to thank Debbie for hosting it, and Rachel, who is our TA provider from RAFA, who has helped many folks in the Kids Count organizations with succession planning, and our 3 executive directors who have generously agreed to tell their story. The reason that we put a lot of intentionality into, it's really two series of calls for the partnership members and Kids Count, and I think the SPP network also did one in May, is because when we looked at the aggregate reports for all 3 networks, succession planning showed up for all of us as being a set of skills that people really needed some additional support and understanding. The core competencies were identified by the field as really essential skills and knowledge for running a 5-star advocacy organization. And we've known at Casey for a very long time that succession planning, executive transitions is incredibly important, because so often our leaders have the institutional knowledge, they're the face of the organization, and when they leave without a thoughtful plan, it can have not only a serious impact on the organization, but on the quality of advocacy in that state. So we view it as a series of skills that all of us need to be competent in and working with and doing successfully for the sake of the field, for kids, and also as legacies for the hard work of folks that have helped build these organizations. So the slides I think that Debbie is showing actually shows the scores and a little bit of data on when executive director transitions and it hasn't been a successful process, we really see the lowering of scores for the whole organization the next year. And that's really the curve we're trying to turn by normalizing conversations about succession, about hearing from leaders at all stages of the succession process. And this final webinar, we're hearing from new execs who came to their position from a variety of circuitous pathways, and learning about what that was like for them and what really mattered in terms of organizational support. So with that, I will turn it over to Rachel from RAFA, who will be kind of sharing the knowledge of, what this part of the succession process really entails. Rachel?
Thank you, Jan. Thank you. Oh, wait. Sorry for that delay. Hi, I'm Rachel Gibson, and I am a strategy and leadership consultant with RAFA. I lead mainly transition-related engagements for long-tenured and founding executives. For those of you on the call who may either be long-tenured or very transformative leaders, there are some nuances to that transition, which we'll talk a little bit about here, but I'm also happy to do some follow-up conversations as necessary. Rafa, for those of you who aren't familiar with our work, we're based in Washington, D.C. Majority of our clients are nonprofits. We focus on a range of back-office processes for nonprofits, so outsourced HR, IT, you name it. My specific practice focuses on executive search and succession planning and leadership transitions. So, in terms of when we work with our organizations, we often, in our first conversations with an executive who may be thinking about transitioning over the next few years, and particularly for those of you on the webinar who you have your departure timeline sometime within the next 3 years, we ask, what is the best and most valuable use of your time in the last 2 or 3 or even 6 months of your tenure, and how are you going to be leading and preparing your organization in this time? And it's a very important question, because what we have found that when leaders spend a lot of time leading, meaning in the day-to-day management, fixing all that there's little time to really think about preparing the organization and really just preparing your life for what to do after you leave the organization. And so this graphic basically talks about or highlights what that looks like visually when you're spending so much time leading that you're not really thinking about, well, how do I ensure that this organization is sustainable beyond me, and what do I even do with my life after I leave? So we suggest a much healthier balance, which this slide shows, which is that, yes, it's not practical to think that you won't be doing any management in your last, say, year or 2 in your role, that there is some management, but that really you're also paying equal attention to that preparation. And what is that preparation? That could be anything from building a leader pipeline in your organization. So it could mean that maybe you're giving your deputy director, your development director, some additional responsibilities. It could be that you're helping to hand off certain relationships or have some shared leadership around certain external relationships. In this case, in many cases, it could be a lot of board development. So if you're thinking that you're leaving in 2-3 years, and you may be saying to yourselves, oh, my board, I can't even see this board actually lead in a transition. So maybe it includes some board development, but you're really thinking through what does it take to get our organization not to perfection, but to a place where it can withstand a transition. For those of you who are long tenured or transformational or founding executives, this is critical to the success of your transition. And then in terms of creating the great rest of your life, what that is that for some of you, when you transition out of that executive director role, CEO role, it is so difficult to think about, what do I do next? What do I do with my career? Am I going to retire? What does retirement look like for me? And that you're spending a significant amount of time also thinking through the personal aspects of transition, and that you're leading, preparing your organization and preparing your life, and that there's equal attention to that. We oftentimes strongly suggest that leaders hire leadership coaches or personal coaches to help them through that personal preparation. So once you have decided that, yes, I am ready and I am ready to make that announcement, and I'll just say your announcement is your announcement. No one should tell you when to announce, and no one should announce it on your behalf. But understanding that there are 3 phases to change, and there's a difference between change and transition. I would say that this graphic, it's William Bridges' model, and for those of you who are kind of organizational development or change management junkies like me, I strongly suggest that you get his book, Managing Transitions by William Bridges. And I think in our follow-up email, I'm happy to actually send the name of the book. It's the bottom of this slide if you don't have time to write it down. But it's a fantastic book about managing transitions, and it's very helpful even if you're not thinking of leaving your organization. But what he talks about is that there's a difference between change and transition. Change is the event. It is when you choose to leave or when a new person starts. Transition is that mental and emotional shift that you make with kind of accepting the new, right? And so when you announce that you are going to be leaving an organization, if you are, which I know you all are, beloved leaders, that people go through different phases. It oftentimes can start with grief, with this hesitancy of letting go, with just feeling lost. There's some staff members, and that neutral zone is oftentimes when you have announced but the new person hasn't started, and there's this confusion around what's next, what happens to me, where will our organization be. Some people have a hard time functioning in that neutral zone because it's ambiguous, it's murky. And then there's some people who thrive in that neutral zone. They love it, right? And then there's that new beginning, which is looking at the opportunities for new leadership, new stakeholders. And you find that when you have announced, sometimes you have board members who go straight to the new beginning, and those are the board members who will say, all right, when are we launching this search? While there may be other board members who are saying, wait, no, let's slow down. This is hard. Let's figure this out. And just trying to navigate all those kind of dynamics and personalities is very hard, but it's very important as you start to kind of plan for that transition. So again, I will send more information about William Bridges' book, but I really highly recommend that you all get it. And then finally, just to set some grounding before our other speakers talk about their stories, that we in our practice, we often say that the search process, broadly speaking, search process, there are 3 phases. Now, every phrase looks different for every organization, and as you hear from your speakers, different people kind of tackle this differently. But your prepare phase is really where board and staff and a consultant, if you're working with a consultant, kind of gets into alignment around the priorities of your organization. Where do you want to be in 5 to 7 years? And what leadership attributes and skill sets will help you on that journey, right? What do stakeholders think about our organization? What is our reputation? And you really kind of get into clarity. And from that, that's when oftentimes your position profile or position announcement is, developed. And then that search piece, which I find there is sometimes a lot of anxiety around the search piece, but the search piece is actually not hard if you spend a significant amount of time preparing. For those of you who are long tenured or transformational leaders, you want to probably spend a good amount of months, maybe not 6 months, in that kind of preparation phase of the search process, and you launch into your search. Your search is where you're recruiting, you're screening, you're selecting, you're hiring. So a lot of that is tactics. Can you do your search on your own? Absolutely. I see it all the time. Oftentimes where an external search consultant comes in is a lot of support and guidance through this search phase because it's not easy. But if you have that expertise on your team, it is possible to do it. And then the most critical part, which unfortunately is the most, the one that people get so burnt out they forget about it, is the onboarding. This is what makes transition, as we talked about in the prior slide, occur in a more solid state. And that onboarding is thinking critically about how do you support your new leader. What do you need? If you're an internal candidate and you're hired, oftentimes boards think, oh, they understand. We don't need to do anything. Well, I often suggest that your onboarding process is more like sometimes a 2-year process to be very thoughtful about what that looks like in the first 2. And if you're following a founder, 3 years post-hire. So that, in a nutshell, as I mentioned, the process overview, this happens in many different ways for different organizations, but if you want a very simple way to think about the phases of, what is a 9-month or a 1-year search process look like, these are the 3 main chunks. So I just wanted to provide some framing and some background around transition and around search, and our speakers will now get more into sharing their stories and their lessons learned. So Kelly, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. Your comments were great. I wish I would have had those a year ago. Hello, everyone. This is Kelly Cosby. I'm the CEO of the Colorado Children's Campaign, and I'm a CEO that was hired from the outside. The Children's Campaign hired an outside consultant that managed their hiring process that brought me to then ultimately to the organization. One of the pieces I think that's important is the context under which that hiring happens. For me, the former CEO of the Children's Campaign was beloved. She was here for years, chose to leave, and I chose to leave my prior organization, and I think that makes a difference for the context in which you inherit the staff or the culture when it's been positive, or if it had been different, if there had been a firing or something else, that might have changed some of then the strategies for the onboarding and some other things. But I came in under great circumstances. And I'll share with you what helped that the Children's Campaign did as part of me coming on board, and some of the things I think that I did that helped the staff and board and others be able to make the change. Because, again, they love the prior CEO. I love her. And so I was sensitive to that and also embracing it because it led to a really positive atmosphere. So here are some of the things that I think worked well. Before I arrived, I had been hired, and before I then came on board, almost every board member from the Children's Campaign emailed me, reached out to congratulate me and say how excited they were, and that was just a small but great gesture to feel like there's some excitement, because as I was departing, there's some sadness and there's so much transition and hard to leave, and yet you're being then pulled in this really positive direction through these emails and outreach from board members. They also gave me time to wrap up my old job and get time to rejuvenate. I had 3 weeks before I started and from when I ended. And so this allowed me to get my departure right, to be able to preserve long-standing relationships I had in the community through my other organization, and then prepare and get rejuvenated to then start this new endeavor. And I thought having that time was generous, and it was great. They also the Children's Campaign had selected a really strong interim director that was a staff member, and also the admin assistant, who was terrific. So one of the things that helped is that they prioritized decisions that I needed to make and would reach out to me before I arrived. So during that time before I got here, when they communicated with me, it was very intentional and things that had to happen, but I didn't get caught up in a bunch of other emails and all that before I was actually onboarded. The other piece that was helpful was that the current board chair at that time, who spoke on a prior webinar, Remy, was terrific, and she had jumped in to help the staff during our big annual event. Huge luncheon that we do was upcoming, and so she jumped in to make sure that with staff there was enough support before I then came on board and could help make that happen. So when I arrived, here are some things that I thought were also helpful. is that I knew that with any of these staff changes, with these transitions, that it induces stress, good or bad. It induces stress. It's a big change. And so when I came on board, I owned my role right away. So my very first day, led the staff meeting. In advance, I'd gotten a standing agenda and just sort of sent a good message that I'm now here, I'm doing this, and I did that piece of it. I also met with the interim director right away, a great staff member, and I took off his plate the things that the ED should be doing. Even if I didn't know all the details about everything, I would at some point, but I took it off his plate to be able to have him then do the job he was actually paid to do, and to be able to do that well, which was a huge relief to him, I think, to be able to hand that over right away. And the other is that I jumped right into that event planning and with the development team so that the board chair could step out of that role and then be able to jump into that annual event planning. The other piece was that they had staff that were super helpful, and I think it helps in advance to line that up for the new person coming in, between the admin assistant who had helped plan my orientation and onboarding. She was very intentional and thoughtful. She also helped. She was sort of my wingman to be able to be the voice in my ear about who is this that we're meeting with, what's the background, the institutional knowledge that helped me to better understand and quicker who some of our staff and key players and people were. And she was just super helpful coming on board to have somebody who really knew the organization and who was really helpful in scheduling and providing support. I relied heavily also on our communications director to make sure that when I came on board, the tone, the messaging was in line with how the culture and the history of the organization would be represented, to make sure I wasn't changing any of that or sending the wrong message and messing up too soon. So she really helped with that, and I think that added some continuity and some reassurance with the public and who I was interacting with. I also met with every single staff member, every intern, and gave them some guided questions for a one-on-one so that I could better understand everyone's role and get their feedback, and to also see if there were any red flags or things that I needed to pay attention to right away from having met with the staff. And then what was also helpful was that with the admin assistant and with some key staff is that we then strategized about setting up meetings with key stakeholders, funders, some of our founding board members, the two prior CEOs. I met with them individually and got their take because they had such a long history, each of them, with our organization. And the same with any of our community partners, especially around our equity work. I wanted to send a message to the community right away that they were valued, that this is a priority, and that I prioritized them within my first week or two of the campaign, of me coming on board to the campaign. A couple of other things that were helpful is that we planned welcome events, and the staff are already underway with this so that donors and some other big stakeholders would have public and private ways of being able to get to know me, meet with me, hear from me about our vision and direction, and to get some reassurance about what was changing or not changing, that I wasn't just coming in and disrupting everything, but maintaining the great reputation of the children's campaign. And then one last piece that is helpful, I think, in transitions, and for me, and maybe not necessarily from the organization, but that I worked with the CFO and was able to assess and looked at right away the structure, the salary ranges, the tenure of the staff, their titles, to just see how all of that was calibrated to get an indication of whether any of that might have needed tweaked or changed in my time, and then just participated heavily in meetings, processes, just to absorb and learn and to better understand what was efficient or not efficient, to be able to get some insights and make changes if needed over time. The last thing I'll say on what would have been helpful, Rachel referenced this, is just the lack of institutional knowledge when you have really great leaders that then leave after a long time. I'm sure that was true of the organization that I left. I'm sure I left things I didn't give enough information when I left in certain areas, and then of course I inherit some of that too. So I would really emphasize the need to institutionalize, get whatever's in your head out of your head and institutionalize before you leave somewhere, and then make sure that it's there for the next person to carry on that legacy. And I'll wrap it up with that.
There. Sorry about that. Before we move on to Melanie, I just want to check if any of you have questions. You can enter it in that chat box. And I'm not seeing any, so we will go ahead. But please remember that if you have questions as we move through the webinar, just enter them there so that we can make sure they get answered. Melanie, it's your turn next.
Thank you, Debbie, and greetings, everybody, from good old Alabama. So I'm just going to start with an opener to one of my favorite inspirational quotes, which I think, is really relevant for today's conversation. But it's leaders are called to stand in that lonely place between the no longer and the not yet, and intentionally make decisions that will bind, forge, move, and create history. And it's really that first line about leaders being in that lonely place, which resonated with me 3 years ago as the oncoming ED at Voices for Alabama's Children, because I think that's a true description of what it's like to lead generally, and particularly so when you are following an 18-year-long executive director, which was very closely branded with the organization and in many ways credited, with its complete and total success. And that was my story. But I will say that having a sound transition and search process really made the last 3 years not quite as lonely for me, and above all, very, very successful. So I want to share a few of the keys as I see them to that success. So I've already alluded to a portion of my story, which is, inheriting, organization as a very young first-time ED. I previously worked for my predecessor as our governmental affairs staffer and the kids count person, so there was some institutional knowledge for me going in. The environment at the time when my predecessor announced, her resignation, there was a lot of local buzz around, the search for the new Voices ED, certainly because it has a stellar reputation, but also because of the identity of the organization being so closely linked to the outgoing ED. And so, there was questions about, would the search committee find the right person? Could this person actually follow the outgoing ED? And more than anything, could Voices withstand the transition? And so, yes, and yes. Since coming on board at Voices, we've completely transformed the staffing capacity and further developed and sustained a powerhouse of a board. I think we've moved policy like never before. We are on average getting 2 legislative victories each year, and we've nearly doubled our operating budget. So yes, you can survive a transition after a long time ED. But underlying much of that success in my mind are a couple of themes, and that's focus and intentionality. Almost nothing was left to chance in this process. It was very well executed. And it kind of starts at ground zero with the search process. So we were very fortunate to have the support from the Casey Foundation to secure transition guides, to steer this national search. But it was really the makeup of the search committee that stands out most to me. We had founding board, current board, C-suite execs who represent, the core of our corporate partnerships. We had a couple of foundation heads and longtime EDs. So we had some really key stakeholders. You had people who held the organization's past, but also its future, moving in the same direction in a very concerted effort to select the next ED. So there was tons of buy-in. And I think the search committee in many ways saw themselves as a prelude, to the next era of the organization. One thing I'll point out here in the sort of search/transition process is that the outgoing ED, my predecessor, she was not involved in the interview process until the end. And so I just point that out. I think it was a smart move on many levels, but I think for me, it assured me that it was an objective process. And I happen to be, have a great relationship with the outgoing ED. But all in all, it was still important for me to know that, I was going to be evaluated not on anything other than what I presented at that point in my career. And so it was very evident that the search committee had spent a lot of time together, and they spent a lot of time thinking strategically about what the new ED should be versus who it should be. And so, there was no politics involved in the selection process, which, I certainly came to appreciate. They also had a very keen sense of the challenges and the realities that were coming down the pipe for the new ED. In the interview process, it kind of played out more like a board meeting, like a strategic planning session versus the interview process. I mean, we were talking about, some really interesting concepts such as, mission creep and staff terminations, all in an effort to really, I think, size up if the candidates were going to be able to do, what it takes to transform the organization in the way that the board and the search committee envisioned. So, once the hiring decision was made, there was, another intentional move, which was to have a very clean break between, the incoming ED and my predecessor as the outgoing ED. And I really want to point that out for those of you on the call, who are nearing this process, because I've been consulted on a couple of local hires here lately, organizations that have transitioned out longtime EDs, and I gave this very advice, and they didn't follow. Now, this is completely anecdotal, but it has proven to be a very difficult transition. So I think it is important to have a very clean break, however that is defined for your organization. But I just wanted to underscore that because I think it really helped the staff, it helped the board, and ultimately it helped me. So my onboarding was probably with the outgoing ED a little over a week. Now, the fact that I was returning to the organization certainly helped, I think, color that decision. I knew the history of the organization. So I selected two key priorities that we spent the week on, and that is fund development and board relations, and that is all we talked about for that week. And it wasn't the stuff that I could read on the internet. I wanted to know the real story to really help me formulate my strategy. I did receive a very robust document that I know the staff and transition guides put a lot of work into. It may have been over 300 pages just with historical information that I keep handy, but I spent most of my time listening and learning from the outgoing ED, the board, and the staff, and certainly our external partners. One of the things that I appreciated about having sort of an external third-party search company was, Catrice Brown. I'll never forget her name. She was my angel, but was very honest with me about my expected shelf life following a long-time ED, that I was expected to last about 18 months, and that was really startling for me. So, post-election process, I immediately began identifying, priorities for my first 90 days in a document that had no rhyme or reason other than things in my head that I titled Melanie's, Ramblings. Ultimately, that got turned into a strategic plan, but, it was the beginning of crafting what those first 90 days would look like that I believe helped, very strongly in the transition, and taking ownership of my first 90 days and not waiting, certainly, for other folks to weigh in on that. And so a big part of that was accelerating my learning curve and creating, a self-improvement plan. The board afforded me an executive coach, which I think was incredibly helpful. So I didn't leave having, transition guides being there sort of coaching me through the search process and then fall off a cliff once I got the job. That support continued in the form of an executive coach. So if that's a possibility for your organization, and that was all in kind. We searched the board and had, some capacity on the board to be able to do that and donate that time to me for an entire year. From the talent management director for Blue Cross Blue Shield. So she knows her stuff. And she also is very skilled in strategic planning and offered to mentor me and to coach me. So that was, really important, I think, to the transition. I think another key focus on strengthening the organization during the transition was, focusing on board development, particularly honing in on board champions. I don't know if this was intentional, but the president, my first year on the job, could not have been a better fit for an incoming new ED. But I do want to point it out because, his experience, I'm talking 30 years or more, nonprofit board governance, very steady hand, former judge, political fundraiser. I mean, he just was not afraid or scared off by very much. And I, as an incoming ED of an organization that had been led by the same person for over 18 years, there were a lot of major changes. And I needed someone at the helm along with me to instill confidence in the board, but also to support the board through what were about to be some very significant changes. I also negotiated as a part of my hiring to recruit one of my own board members of my choosing. That was a really important, strategic move for me anyway, to be sure that I had folks on the board who were going to, be supportive. And there wasn't resistance on the board. The readiness level was certainly there. So it may not have been a necessary move, but it is an intentional move that I made. And I think one additional caveat under this particular, frame of board champions is really having a shared vision. And all of that came to bear during the interview process. So we were always moving in the same direction. Another key focus during the transition phase was transforming the mission. I couldn't do everything at one time, though, so it was really about prioritizing where we wanted to start. And for me, it was very obvious. Our research component, our kids count work was very strong. Where we all saw an opportunity for growth was our advocacy work. And, some of the transition obviously comes down to just making the right hire. The search committee clearly had a concept of what they wanted to see, and it happened to be a perfect match to my skill set. The only thing I've ever done in my short career is governmental affairs and lobbying. So if you tell me you want to rebuild and transform an advocacy platform, I'm definitely the girl for the job. So I think together we were able to find and really work in our strengths, which I believe helped sustain us and make us, the organization that we are today, which we're all very, very proud of. One of the biggest challenges that I will point out here at the end, I think, in breathing new life into a mission is getting the right people on the bus. And that's external partners, from coalition partners to donors, to contract employees, but also to staff, which is, where I want to go next, because building a competent team, was top of mind for me. Building this culture of excellence that far outlasts me is really where I did and have continued to focus a lot of my energy. It is by far, for me at least, the least pleasant part of my transition. But I was surrounded by a group of folks on my board who were very clear with me that, it's second nature to want to focus on external threats, but it's the internal threats that sink ships. And so assessing the staff capacity and really reconciling that with my shared vision with the board of who we wanted to be as an organization helped us see very quickly that there are some internal threats as far as staff capacity. So, I spent my first year or so really building out the core functions of the organization, investing in our people through professional development where appropriate, and ultimately putting in place performance metrics to be sure that the functions and the outcomes really align with where we are trying to drive the mission. So we wanted staff that could drive the mission, not simply, support it. And so my cautionary tale here is, if you're a board member or an outgoing ED and there are significant challenges in the staffing capacity, ideally it'd be great to address those head on, but certainly being transparent with the incoming ED and being sure that the board and the people around the ED, as in my situation, are prepared for what it looks like. So all in all, I believe having I've said board a million times, but having a strong board helped me map out my first 90 days on the job. Which included several things, assessing the organizational capacity, like I said, face-to-face donor meetings, focusing on external relations with lawmakers and the such, but also identifying professional development for the board was a really big part of year one. And the Casey Foundation was very gracious to help us with that as well. We were able to walk away from one of those relationships with a fund development strategy, which I think alleviated an incredible amount of pressure, because I kind of still feel like I'm in transition, but coming out. So I think it's been a really wicked game of chess for the past 3 years, but it's really all these pieces, in my opinion, that have made my transition successful and I would say, victorious. So thanks for letting me speak a little bit.
Thank you, Melanie. Before we move on to Annie, I do want to remind you again that you can give us questions for any of our 3 speakers so far in the chat box. And I also want to point out that Transition Guides, which worked with Melanie, the organization that she talked about so much, is actually now part of RAFA, which is the organization that Rachel is with. So basically it's the same practice that she found so helpful. So I want to move us on now, since we don't seem to have questions, to our final speaker, Annie. And I do want to, we're obviously extremely grateful to all of our presenters, but I do particularly want to thank Annie because she actually left early from a ceremony at which she was getting an award in order to speak on this webinar. So Annie, it's your turn.
Thanks, Deb. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with everybody about what our transition and experience was like in Kansas. I've been in the seat of leadership at Kansas Action for Children now for 1 year and 20 days. So I made it past the 1-year mark. I will say that CEO years feel a little bit like dog years, and so I'm pleased to have gotten past the first 12 months and really can look back and see a lot of valuable lessons learned and insights from this transition of promotion from within. I am part of an organization that has been around for 40 years, and to place some context around our last transition, I was following in the footsteps of someone who had been the CEO for about 7 years, but had been with the organization for nearly 20. And in fact, in the last 20 years, Kansas Action for Children had only had 2 leaders. And so there's not been a tremendous amount of experience with transition. However, the last CEO took her experience and worked to create a lot of structure and process so as to improve for the next time around. And so I was really the beneficiary of a lot of careful planning and takeaways from what her experience had been. And sort of the beneficiary of some ahas. Although I will say there were still some continued steps that I see that we'll need to take into the future. So part of that process that was identified after the last transition was to have some things clearly articulated in a succession plan. The importance of identifying 1 or more potential internal successors for grooming and development. So what this meant for me, I came on board at Kansas Action for Children about 5 years ago. And over the course of my time as the then CEO saw potential for leadership, she began to position me to have some experiences so as to be part of that grooming and development. So for example, I was able to connect with funders and manage key stakeholder relationships. So that I was a known quantity to philanthropic leaders, both in state and at the national level. I was also responsible for leading a board subcommittee and appearing before our board of directors to brief them on work we were doing and organizational efforts. I also interfaced with policymakers and was involved in testifying on behalf of the organization's policy priorities. So when we look at sort of a subset of some of the competencies of the organizational lead, I was able to practice those in smaller ways incrementally over my time leading up to stepping into this role. It's also critical to plan the process for leadership transition, and I think we've heard several folks talk about this. I heard Rachel say some things that really resonated with what our experience was here. And at our organization, this includes a professional development plan for all staff at all levels of the organization. There's also a succession checklist for management and board members. We have a CEO profile to aid in identifying objectively potential leaders. And then we also have an emergency succession plan that includes specific steps to take at every type of emergency succession situation, so short-term, long-term, or permanent. And so as we were going through that process of identifying my skill sets as it became more evident that the CEO was looking to transition, It meant working with the CEO to identify gaps in my organizational knowledge and skill sets. So for me, this was really around managing the overall organizational budget. That was not something that I had as much access to or involvement with in my previous role. It also meant having some conversations about what it meant and what the experience was in managing the board. So two key functions of the CEO were not shoes that I walked in my previous role, and wasn't going to have the opportunity to until I really got in the seat, but had a chance to really walk through some of those pieces with the CEO. Even though I was an internal successor, and not new to the organization, I was still new to the role, and there was a period of adjustment. So for the better part of the last year, looking at sort of a full organizational cycle, so both in terms of our budgeting process, the legislative session, key events, there were some things that the previous CEO could tell me as an internal successor, but I just couldn't truly understand until I had experienced it for myself. And I was fortunate to have a very close working relationship with the past CEO. I was her executive vice president, and so we worked in tandem on a lot of things and had a lot of really robust conversations. And over the course of the last year, as I still maintain a relationship with her, I think I send her a message probably 1 or 2 times a week where I say, that lesson was not lost on me. I stored it away, and now I understand. And we usually have a pretty good laugh about it. So some things that went well, I mentioned that I had a lot of opportunity to step into the shoes, playing a smaller parallel role, which really helped give me a baseline for what this first year was going to be like. I also had access to the previous CEO. So I heard a couple of people talk about making a clean break and being very intentional about that, and that is something that was reflected in our updated succession plan and grooming an internal candidate, that the CEO, the outgoing CEO, would not stay on in any formal capacity within the physical space. But there was an opportunity for us to contract with the previous CEO if the incoming CEO felt it necessary. And for me, this was an important tool that I had available to me as I sort of traversed the first year. There were questions that I wasn't going to be able to answer. I heard Rachel talk about institutional knowledge and getting things in your head, out of your head. Despite the fact that we were intentional about our succession plan, there were still things that were in my previous CEO's head that I wouldn't know to ask about until I came upon that experience. And so we had a contract with her that really sort of looked like technical assistance, my ability to ask questions, to get support, troubleshooting, some mentoring, because to be quite candid, leadership is lonely. And having that access to her gave me a place to go in what is a very challenging first year, stepping into a very highly visible role with a lot on the line, particularly in Kansas in the last year. We've faced a lot of pretty steep hills to climb legislatively, with Kansas Action for Children at the forefront of those. And so having that contract with her was of great value to me. And I think also of significant value to our organization as we were able to maintain the high level of quality that people had become accustomed to with Kansas Action for Children. So I think also I mentioned that the past CEO had gleaned a lot of lessons from the previous transition, and she really took steps to set me up, or the next CEO up, for success by fine-tuning the organizational structure, implementing best practices around board function and some other things, so that really she was turning over something that as an organization that was in pretty good shape for the next leader. So some things that were challenging. This wasn't just a transition for me. This was a transition for our entire staff. And while I think that they felt, some relief that the next leader was going to be known to them, I recognize now, looking back, that we did a great job as a senior leadership team preparing for transition. But I don't know that we were as intentional about bringing our mid-level and junior level and entry-level staff along too, and really helping them understand what was going to change. I think that while they were relieved that we weren't going to do a search and look to somebody outside and there wasn't going to be a disruption in culture, I don't know that they wrapped their heads around what this meant for them. And what it meant for them was that my relationship with them changed. Whereas before they had a lot of access to me because I was the executive vice president and I was the one making sure the trains were running on time and working with them on project development and those pieces. Now in my new role as CEO, I had other things on my plate that were critical and that only the CEO could do, and it meant that they too had to step up. And I think that that's been some of the challenges, that we were not bringing them along in that conversation, and I can think that that's probably something that we'll be a little bit more intentional about in the future. I should also add that it's important to understand that our staff composition is one of largely younger, newer professionals, and so this really marked the first time for them professionally that they had experienced an organizational transition. So just another important thing to note. I had some helpful supports, and part of this was based on some things that I identified that I knew that I would need, and part of it was also based on organizational history. So I mentioned the contract with the past CEO. Now that a year has passed, I feel pretty good as I've had sort of one lap around the block, so to speak. I know that she'll always be available to answer my questions, but we no longer have that contract. I also had a leadership coach. That's something that's mentioned in the succession plan, that the new CEO will have access to a leadership coach. And so at times I have used that, that coach to bounce some things off of, sort of stepping into these new shoes. And then I also have down on my notes here in quotation marks, marriage counseling. So I mentioned that we were sort of transitioning as a leadership team, and I now was going to be the boss of someone who was once my peer on the senior leadership structure. So we actually took it upon ourselves to engage that same professional coach, and my vice president of administration and I, over the course of the last year, went and met with that coach probably 3 to 5 times, just to have a space to do a check-in, to figure out how things are going, to make sure our senior leadership relationship was still intact and weathering the transition and really flourishing. So I think some of the intentionality in those relationship supports has been really helpful for our kind of internal transition and success over the last year. I also have a very active and supportive board chair. I heard Melanie mention that the board president, upon her stepping into the role, was a really good fit for her. Again, I was the beneficiary of a thoughtful CEO who was really looking at the composition of our board and knew that the incoming board president was probably going to be about as perfect of a fit for me as you could get. And as a result of that, that board chair and I have worked very closely together in the last year, offline and online, supporting one another, checking in, moving through some tough decisions. There were also other organizational supporters who were really invested in the success of the organization and reached out wanting to know how they could be of best support to me in this new role. So really a beneficiary of a lot of previous people's experience in stepping into this role. A few things that I can see that we'll want to fine-tune moving into the future so as to sort of iron out a few wrinkles with transition. But in terms of promotion from the inside, some of the steps that we took prior and the opportunities I had to be exposed in small ways to the CEO's role really played a critical part in my success in this last year. And that is all that I have, Deb.
Annie, thank you so much. So this is, another call for questions, but I'm going to, while you think about your questions in the audience, I'm going to ask Annie to respond to a question that Kelly put in, which was that, Annie, you mentioned that you did a professional development plan and possibly succession plan with each staff member, and Kelly would like to know more about that.
Yeah, so you did hear that right. We do a professional development plan, not a succession plan, but a professional development plan with each staff member. That's a feature within our organizational structure. So every year we'll do a professional development plan and identify sort of 2 performance objectives for each staff member, and those are largely about not just skill building, but really kind of increasing competency and capacities as it relates to contributing to the organization. So as we were preparing for succession, we had that in mind as we were crafting the professional development plans for each staff member. So while my previous CEO knew that she was going to be transitioning in the next couple of years, she sort of had a target in mind of outlasting our current governor. And then there was an opportunity that came up that was just perfect for her. And so her timeline changed. Had we had more time, I think we would have seen those professional development plans probably kick in and maybe better prepare our junior level staff. But I would say that it is a tool we have. We just didn't see it fully realized in kind of the transition over because our timeline got truncated some. And I'd be happy to share any of those tools. My email is on the screen, and I'd be happy to share any of those as example docs if people are interested in having those.
Annie, that would be great. We don't seem to have more questions, so I'm going to talk for just a moment about the follow-up to the webinar. First of all, on your screen now, we have a slide from the Advocacy Learning Lab, which hopefully you all are familiar with, and if you're not, shoot me an email and we'll orient you to it. And that's where we post basic descriptions of competencies, I think we're now over 100 competencies that we believe that strong child advocacy organizations need. And all of the materials from this webinar will be posted there in the succession planning competency that you see in front of you. This webinar was is being recorded, and so we will share the recording and the slides. And Annie, I would love to get the examples that you mentioned as well to share with everybody, and then we'll put them all up in the Advocacy Learning Lab so that you can go back and listen to them. I don't know about other people, but I know that this was such a rich webinar. I'm going to be doing that just for my own knowledge. Rachel, I see you have one final comment, so if you want to.
Yes, just one final point. So I think, listening to the stories of executive directors, what we find in our work when new CEOs who follow long tenured or founding executives, when they leave within the first 3 years of their tenure, there are usually three reasons that they leave. Sometimes it's that the job isn't presented the way it was presented to them during the search process. And sometimes it's also as a result of salary. So in some cases, new executives have to cut their salary as their first act of business. But the number one reason why when we see individuals leave within the first 3 years, it's as a result of misalignment with the board and with themselves, so that they're not aligned, they're not on the same page with the board chair, they're not on the same page with the board. And I think what the stories that we heard really highlighted is that, in my opinion, the number one and the most critical factor to ensuring a successful transition, particularly following a long-tenured or founding executive, the number one factor is close alignment, close communication, lots of coordination, and just trust, general trust between the new executive and the board chair or the board as a whole. And so I think the stories that we heard, that was a theme that is very reflective of our work at RAFA, and it was interesting to hear it being called out in their specific stories as well. So for those of you who are thinking about leaving within the next 3 years or so, whatever you can do to focus on board development, board succession planning, thinking about who that board chair will be when the search is about to start, those are some critical decisions to make during the last few years of your tenure. And that's all from me.
Great, thank you. Melanie and Kelly and Annie, do any of you have any final comments before we close this out? Actually, Melanie got off, but Annie or Kelly?
Debbie, this is Jan.
Hi.
I also want to remind everybody on the phone that the Casey Foundation provides support for executive directors to attend the 2-day succession planning webinar. Rafa offers that 3 times a year. It's information about it is in the Advocacy Learning Lab, but you can also follow up with me to see whether or not we have the resources to support that. So that
and just to clarify, not a webinar, it's an in-person, Jan.
It's an in-person meeting, and if you would like
Yeah.
more information, just contact me. Thank you.
Thanks, Jan. I want to really thank all of our presenters. This was a fabulous webinar, and Melanie hopped off because she had to go make a speech in 10 minutes. She did this all in a hotel doing a conference. Annie, as I said, left an event where she was getting an award early in order to join us, and I really appreciate this. I think for any organization that's going through a transition, it can be such a challenging time that having these kinds of words of wisdom is really important, and our ability to put this in the Advocacy Learning Lab and in the partnership website so people can go back to it for years and learn from your experience will be really helpful to them. So I'm going to thank everybody now and end the recording and wish you all a good day. Have a wonderful time for the rest of the day.